Greetings, this is Craig Pepin, Project Lead for the Davis Grant. Thank you for listening to this audio recording from the Spring 2024 Competency Fellows Workshop Series. These workshops are funded by a grant from the Davis Educational Foundation, and together with other materials funded by the grant and available on the Competencies website, are designed to help enhance your understanding and learning of Champlain College competencies. Today's workshop, titled Defeat Pseudoscience, Teaching Scientific Literacy, is led by Sarah Beno, our Scientific Literacy Fellow. Thanks to everybody for coming. This is the 10th workshop in this semester of the Davis Grant, embedding the college competencies, Competency Fellows. Sarah is one of my Competency Fellows. I'm very happy that she's here to talk about, I'm not going to read the slide because that's just bad. You read this out. Defeating Pseudoscience. Should I record this, Max?
You can too. If you want to kick that from
All right. I'm going to record this as well, primarily so we can generate a transcript. So just want everybody to know about that in advance. And
okay. Are we good? All right. So thanks for joining me today. I am the Davis Grant Fellow for Scientific Literacy. And so, my title is Defeating Pseudoscience, Teaching Scientific Literacy for the Public Good. And obviously, currently here at Champlain, we have no science major. The way I approach my classes is really like this specifically. Like, we really want to make sure that students understand what is out there and how to decipher whether or not these headlines are truly valid. So that's kind of how I approach a lot of my teaching as well. So our outline for today, and I'm hoping that this will be really more of a discussion. I have some slides, but I promise not too many. But we'll discuss kind of what scientific literacy means as a college competency, as a life skill. Review that scientific literacy competency, so kind of where we're at with our rubric and where we are for how we assess it in the classroom. And then I'd like to kind of use this opportunity to hear from you all how you teach scientific literacy in the classroom and kind of share some anecdotes of my own as well. So this is what I have on our agenda for today. So to start out, what is it that we really mean by scientific literacy? And I'm open to responses here.
I always think of this as like intertwined with information, whether it's like what are credible science organizations, what it's peer-reviewed work. So I think it has a dovetailed with info literacy. Absolutely, importantly.
I think of it as like the process for science too, but like scientific method.
And so it's from like a journalism background. So it's like, when I'm reading an article, is this based off, I know legitimate is art, but legitimate science like doesn't hold the muster as to like peer review, right? All those sort of things that come with that. And I mean, the journalist, like I'm not a science journalist, so when I'm written science articles, I go to the studies authors and ask them because I don't want to misinterpret it because that is not my wheelhouse. But just trying to figure out if I'm reading a piece of science in journalism, is this true or not? I guess that's like a really simple definition, but yeah, absolutely.
So for me, it means going beyond just asking the question about legitimate science in the general sense, but even among peer-reviewed things, having to go deeper to know what you can trust and what you can't. Even there, there's many things that are peer-reviewed that are questionable.
Absolutely. That is something that is becoming more and more of an issue as time goes on too. But yeah, I think all of these are really great definitions that we have to kind of bring together in order to truly assess scientific literacy. And so as like goals for our students, those of you that teach science classes, and even if you don't teach a science class, but you are hoping that your students can find accurate information, what are your goals in terms of scientific literacy?
I think it'd be nice. I teach a writing class, but if they're looking for sources, okay, so what are some red flags? When you, like just big red flags when you're looking at these sources that determine it as something not to trust.
I would love to see our students, and it's thanks for a statistician and Daniel Kahneman fan, fast and slow thinking, and how our students are reading these types of articles or hearing things, that they slow down and use their slow processing side of their brain, as opposed to the one that reacts quickly and just read what they want.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Bob Racine. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, it's lovely, good. Yes. For me, I mean, I think one of the things that I would like to see in the scientific literacy is the recognition that science is a distinct epistemology, and that it's a way of knowing about natural phenomena, and not just a bunch of buzzwords. That the real starting point for scientific literacy is to sort of understand scientific thinking, not to have to be bogged down in the details of chemistry and biology. That comes later, just to understand the dynamics of how one creates knowledge using this particular set of tools.
Yeah, I think that's another really great point, that we do need to, kind of establish that higher level understanding of science versus that nitty gritty details, because we're really not working with those types of students in this setting. So
I guess at the same time, though, I do think the details of biology and chemistry are really important. And I am surprised at how little students do know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's, since most of them take one science class, we can kind of hope that they learn the skills and basic information needed to understand it at a deeper level. I think that's a good point as well.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this idea of so much of what science is the way it's communicated is through numbers and data, and it's at least knowing what to look for that scientists should be doing to establish whether or not whether those numbers have meaning, and whether they can demonstrate that those numbers, how they arrived at them, and how they can show how they try, meaning for which they show that they have meaning.
Yeah, that's another one that gets really complicated. I think students, especially if they haven't had exposure to statistics yet, really like that word statistically, or they just like significant, right? Like there's a significant difference here. I get that one all the time when we do presentations, and I'm like, well, is there? Like there's not even, like you're presenting a figure and there's not even any indication that it is different.
So, significant isn't an opinion.
Right. So yeah, there's a lot of that data analysis and understanding that's pretty important as well.
Yeah, you said it much better than last time. Yeah, that's really good.
No, yeah, great. I'm glad we're on the same page. Yeah, I think that there's definitely, I think it sounds like we're all on kind of similar pages and things that are really well encompassed by the rubric that we already have for scientific literacy. So this is really good job for those of you that have worked on it. It's in great shape. I do have some definitions from a variety of sources for what we're kind of looking for scientific literacy. So I'll just kind of go through a few of those. John Miller from the International Center of Advancement of Scientific Literacy at the University of Michigan says civic scientific literacy represents the level of reading and comprehension skills needed to read the science section of the Tuesday New York Times. It is pretty specific, but I think it's, kind of setting that bar of we have kind of that civic level of understanding. I personally would like to aim for a little bit higher, but, I think this is a really great starting point, is that they can go and read an article about science and have at least an interest or understanding of what it's about. So that was one definition that I came across. The National Science Education Standards say that scientific literacy is the knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts and processes required for personal decision-making, participation in civic and cultural affairs, and economic productivity. And what I did like about this one, and I'd be interested to hear anyone else's thoughts as well, is that it kind of takes that, like, all right, so you're not going to be a scientist, but why does it matter that you have some level of scientific understanding and scientific literacy? And, having come from Alabama in the middle of the pandemic, this was very loud and clear to me of what people didn't understand about science, because my understanding is that things were a lot different here in Vermont than how they were in Alabama in response to the pandemic. But in Alabama, there was a lot of pushback against trying to limit interactions. There was a lot of pushback against vaccination. And these are things that I feel if people had a better understanding of how science works, they might have had a bit of a different response. So kind of going off that personal decision making, I thought that was an interesting comment, but it does hold some relevance.
Was that written after the pandemic?
I don't believe so. I think it was actually before. So, yeah.
Extra report.
I mean, that's just where my mind always goes in recent times of, that impact of science and kind of seeing that lack of scientific literacy more broadly. And then this group also, through the National Academy Press, released that scientific literacy means that a person can ask, find, or determine answers to questions derived from curiosity about everyday experiences. It means a person has the ability to describe, explain, and predict natural phenomena. And I think this kind of gets to that higher level. I would not expect that necessarily every student is going to be able to predict natural phenomena coming out of our program, but being able to seek answers to their own questions, I think, is a skill that I really want students to have, to be able to, and that's something we can get more into it later, but I have students that are like, I saw this on TikTok. Is it true? And I want to give them the understanding and knowledge base that they can figure that out for themselves and not have to run back to their college professor when they have graduated to, decide that for themselves. So those were, again, just some of the things that I've seen out there. And kind of tying back into my overall goal for students is, this was just an article that I came across from 2020. Contradictory health messages are confusing for the public. Overwhelming amount of health and science news, much of it is overhyped. And so coming from that journalism background, I'm sure you encounter a lot of this. But, we have, a number of headlines here that people are obviously drawn to. They're pulling you in, they want you to read the article. But many people don't go beyond that headline. So is this information truly accurate? Is there data to support it? Was there an experiment done? Like, how did we come to this conclusion? So a lot of my approach is really in that idea of defeating pseudoscience, allowing students to help to figure out, how to decide if something is accurate or how to find the answers to their own questions. So that's what I have for kind of our overview of scientific literacy in a broad scheme. Are there any comments or questions about any of that?
I'd say the third definition, the thing I really liked about it is that it really focuses on process. Mm-hmm. It implies that there is certain particular methods that are scientific, but doesn't explicitly say that. So in some ways, I know what they're getting at, but I wish they were more specific about there's a certain way that you would try to answer questions that is scientific. And there's other ways that you might want to answer questions that are also very valid, but are not scientific. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts or? Okay. We can dive into kind of what we have for scientific literacy at Champlain. And I think a number of you are probably already pretty familiar with our scientific literacy competency, but this is kind of coming from that definition of scientific literacy. But here we have it defined as the ability to identify and understand scientific knowledge and thinking, necessary for participating actively in democracy, engaging in thoughtful global citizens. So I feel like we've kind of encompassed a lot of some of those earlier definitions there. But I like that it's, involving exploring the relevance of scientific thinking and knowledge. So not just
going through the process, but how is it relevant? Why does it matter that we're doing it? To comprehend and address complex problems facing society. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. I have a link to it in here as well if you want to do a deeper dive into our competency. But I do think that what we have so far is a great culmination of kind of what else is out there, and kind of a good culmination of the different thoughts that we all individually had about what is important about scientific literacy. So our criteria within our competency, we have 5 of them. First is, how does science work? So this is really that process and kind of thinking about that scientific method. We have the strengths and limitations of science. So I think that's another really key factor for students to understand that, yes, there have been scientific studies on this and the conclusions of this are XYZ, but maybe that still doesn't definitively conclude that for us, right? There's still other experiments to be done. There could be conflicting evidence out there. And that's, I think, pulling more into that journalism again. I'm teaching a nutrition class this semester, and there's that Netflix docu-series that got really popular right before the semester started that's called like You Are What You Eat. It's really like kind of a vegan docu-series, but the students were like, is it true? And I'm like, okay, let me watch it. And just, but any documentary, right, is going to be very one-sided. Even though there's evidence to support their cause, it's not. So anyway, I've told you I'd have lots of little anecdotes, but this is like students' favorite website. It's not that it's a bad source. It's just not, it's giving them a summary, right? And then we have science and society, which is, I think the students really like this one perhaps the most, and I have a lot of fun teaching within this one of kind of linking scientific research to things going on in everyday life. So I'll tell some anecdotes kind of at the end, but and then I do have our draft competency rubric. We'll see if this works. I don't trust the technology today. If I can
Literally
find
hot off the presses. We were just working on this yesterday.
Yeah.
We're presenting it to the committee tomorrow. Hopefully tomorrow.
Okay, let's see. Can I pull this over here? It worked, sort of. Okay. Can excuse all of my many open tabs as usual. So this is out there. We do have our draft rubric going with a couple of suggested revisions, but honestly, things for this one were in pretty good shape. We didn't make, I don't think we made any major changes to it. Just mostly kind of giving a definition for things where it's not evident, so that students had some sort of reference to that, and then cleaned up some of the criteria to make them a little bit shorter so that it was a faster read for students. And a lot of our edits were based off of feedback from DDL students that, had some clarification issues largely. So, but again, I don't really feel the need to read this to any of you, but we are going to send this in and get some additional feedback and hopefully have revision up soon.
Yeah, the old ones are available.
Yeah.
And the old, again, this
one's really similar.
So don't be afraid to check out the old ones. All Champlain has access to that. So
fine. Cool. All right. So lastly, we kind of move into strategies for teaching. So I'm curious about what you've done in your classes to teach scientific literacy. What sorts of activities have you utilized? Or would you consider maybe adding in, especially if you're not in a true science class, but maybe you want to integrate that in there? And additional strategies we could or should consider using in courses. So I'd love discussion, feedback, thoughts.
One thing I've done in my environmental science classes that I think has been effective just based on the fact that students bring it up in their idea evaluation is I assign like a group a peer-reviewed article, but then I really micromanage the assignment and I give them a slide deck with the title of each slide. So it's what's the hypothesis of this thing? choose one figure and explain what was the methods. Do not focus on the statistics. Like, I'm like, these are the things you need to do. And then they work as a team and they read the paper. And they try and choose peer-reviewed articles that are shorter and it's a little bit more to the point and maybe a little bit more accessible to a general audience. And I feel like it brings together a lot of the things that we talked about like interpreting data and understanding the impact or the relevance on the community. And they're very proud of themselves. But reading a peer-reviewed paper, and I feel like working as a team and presenting it is helpful to bring down their anxiety level from the absolute opinion. That I like that word. And you can choose papers that were just published. Like this is last week. This was published in Nature. I like it. Again, they're reading it. So yeah.
Speaking. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah, in addition to some of those other things that we described, when I taught our making meaningful science course and before my scientific revolution, one of the things I focused on was the statistical mechanics of how experiments work and probability and so the confidence levels to sort of show how the sausage is made to demystify, the sort of popular perception science, which is either all or nothing, sort of like it's either everything's 100% or it's like complete bunk because there's something that's wrong or something. So I go into use the text I use and articles I use. I try to find those that will go into the ways in which scientists develop the levels of confidence they have in the sort of clinical work that they do, and to explain why none of the stuff that you're going to see is going to be 100%, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I think that's a really great way, especially to kind of highlight that reliability and that, science is evolving constantly. We're constantly learning new things and kind of tweaking our understanding.
Yeah, I have an article I've used a lot called "There's No Such Thing as Sound Science." This great article is done in 2017. It looks a really detailed look at the way in which politicians sort of try to cast doubt on certain scientific findings. So, Orestes did this work on tobacco, and then she's moved on to talk about climate science and how the foes of tobacco regulation and climate regulation will argue, sort of take advantage of a popular understanding of science that is absolutely right. And use this to sort of undermine science that is never 100% settled. Science is always, as you know. And so trying to introduce students to understand is, okay, well, 99% or 95% certainty, that's enough for us to move on. That we're never going to get to 100%, but it helps them sort of understand, hopefully without undermining their faith in science. That's the danger. The ways it gets at that particular aspect of science, and also shows the way in which science sort of interfaces with politics, and how there are certain questions that are scientific in nature and then certain questions that are political in nature. Yeah. And what the difference is. So something I use.
Yeah, I have a great one that's very similar to that. It's actually a book, but it's called Food Politics. And it really dives into like how the different stakeholders influence the decisions that are being made for messaging that are, it's like from the government, from the FDA, from the USDA telling us what to eat. But there are a lot of voices there, and yeah, it's kind of questionable. So it's interesting. Yeah.
I have this focused on the teaching about pseudoscience and what I was teaching. But if I did, one of the things I think to get across to students is it's okay to be skeptical and to consult more than one, even peer review source, and try to get as many as you can. Start looking at go through the resources of bibliographies for each one and see what they're referring to, and learn that there are camps of thought. There are controversies even within the scientific community about approaches to things, and that you won't necessarily get a clean answer to something you would like to understand and take position on one side. And then it is always changing, as you were saying.
Yeah.
I wonder if a lot of students know Google Scholar.
Yeah, I think some of them, like I've heard like yes and no, so probably not huge amounts. Yeah.
Not many students that were postdoc, and usually in high school they told us to go through like Britannica, and I was like, oh man, it's like it's cool. Like it's time to go straight to the disc.
Okay, I'll have to start highlighting that a little bit more.
It's interesting to recall like that's what Google started off at, right? Essentially, before it all those that targeting stuff and that stuff. But
I feel like COVID offered a really great topic for scientific literacy because, I was teaching environmental science, and so I started this like unit on public health. We were teaching online, and I taught the course, but then I didn't teach the course again for a year. And so I was like looking at my slides, I'm like, oh my God, all of this is wrong. Like, because we had so little information at that time, and I was just kind of sharing. So I showed that to my students. I'm like, like, well, we know now. Like, you know that hand washing is effective for police stanchion, but it's not, or just like all these things that they're doing, and it's just interesting. Like, it's just showing it's like a body of knowledge, but it is and we're kind of acquiring new information all the time.
It's interesting you bring that up because I reported a little bit on COVID and I got too deep in the weeds on it where I had to check out because of my mental health. But anyways, thinking about the hand washing thing, you still see it like public, what am I trying to say? Public bodies of health, that's not the right word, but like the environment. Yeah, just like public agencies of health, wherever, they still put hand washing as like one of the number one things, and that intersects with politics, right? Because it's like, obviously, COVID is so politicized and has been and still is. Even the question of, are we still in a pandemic? Like, do you attack that from a social science background? Do you attack that from a purely scientific background? And it's, the hand washing thing drives me nuts. Like, yes, hand washing is good. Yeah, it's good. But for COVID, it really doesn't do much. Yeah. So, just a little peppy up. Going on. But I would.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think these points that we were just talking about bring up really good opportunities. Something else I like to do is like have students debate a topic, but they have to find all their own sources. I mean, we'll check them and stuff, but give them, we could use approaches to public health with COVID, right? And they can kind of pull from different sides, or research it with the viewpoint of a specific stakeholder and see how those are going to change your results. So it is kind of interesting to pull in some of those activities. I like all of these that have been mentioned so far.
I'll say one thing that I struggle with, and then as I hear you all talk, is it's like we look at strengths and limitations of science, and we want to like a healthy skepticism about things without eroding public trust. That's right. So finding the balance. So I'm thinking back to the rubric too. It's like we always had this question of like, how do you evaluate science? Like, are you able to evaluate science? And so that fine line, right, between, breeding scientific literacy, a healthy critique and these types of things, and at the same time, knowing where you can get good information and trusting in the body and the institutions of science, which maybe, I don't know, that's something that like is a non-negotiable, in many cases. So how do we do that effectively, right? Excellent point.
What you're saying makes me think about how much can we achieve in a sense of scientific literacy from this point of view. There was a time when we humans had very similar knowledge, very general and broad knowledge, and there wasn't specialization. And at some point, with the growth of the technology and the evolution of human intelligence, it got to be the point that there were experts. And so at some point, in order for things to function, you have experts, you have specialists, and you kind of have to let them do their thing and to sort of look what works out. And so how much can we do in terms of going beyond just trusting taking scientists and mathematicians and so on their word on things, because we can't, it's hard to have enough knowledge in a certain period of time to be able to make a judgment. I mean, it feels sort of cynical to say that, because that's one of those observations of technology and society and specialization. and how they made us into one-dimensional people, so to speak, each of us. And a big part of this is scientists themselves. Literacy it's like scientific communication skills. Right? How do we communicate things? How do you make peer-reviewed articles not as bad as they are? And it's like you people in my own field, I can't even read the articles.
Yeah, and it's like the old articles used to be like you sat down with like a cup of coffee and you could actually read them, and now there's so many like as cited in yours 15 paper, like tracing down a method section, if anyone's had to do that recently, like finding the actual method that they used can take like 6 or 7 papers before you find it, and then it's changed. So
I don't have a solution for how to make it more readable, but have journalists in your circle and they can like great, like I wouldn't call myself like a great like science communicator. Like I said, my background is not in science, but there are some amazing science journalists out there, and those are the ones who I would say go to, because they can break it down. They can make it like, I find it so interesting. Like, for example, pitching an article, it's like you can go across like an article that's been out there for years or whatever, and it's not getting the attention it needs. And then you have this awesome science journalist who finds it or whatever, and then they publicize it and make it really readable and fun to read and all those things. I think that has a lot of power. But I also would like if scientific articles were more readable, so I could understand nothing.
I mean, a lot of things say this problem is going to come from that end.
Mm-hmm.
Like the reason why it's so hard for all of us to know anything and to make decisions and know what science we're talking about, it's just not communicated very well. And I should know at that end of it, it requires us to be experts, or specialists to even understand the introduction sometimes.
So someone online wants to. Jess, you want to talk?
Yeah, so I really love the example that Robin was giving about how she gets her students who are in a science class an actual peer-reviewed journal article and gives them the specific ways to break down that article, because that's kind of like meeting them where they're at in their science class to getting them used to seeing that type of publication. But when I think about like Core 201 and making meaning with science, when we have students that come into the library, I don't necessarily say, come and look at this really complex peer-reviewed scientific study. I will look for something that is in something like Science News, which is kind of meeting people at a level where it's readable, and it will get that we can swim up the original scientific study if we want to, but it explains things and concepts in a language and a reading level that's more comprehensible for someone who's not a science major. And then you look that up, like maybe now it's been reviewed and the New York Times, so that bumps it up another level. And maybe you move on to Discover magazine or another science magazine. And so sometimes we kind of meet them where they are before we like thrust them into that really big scientific peer-reviewed journal article, which at the time, you're right, you don't understand all the equations in it and what it means and your methodology. So kind of like that's where you could meet those the core students where they are in terms of that scientific literacy.
Thanks, Jess. One thing I should say was when I send them the peer-reviewed article, I have them read the Science Daily version first, which often has an interview with the author. And so I'm like, read that so you have an idea of what you're about to read and give you some context, and then you could read the peer-reviewed article. So I feel like that's really helpful.
And for science too.
It's like an online.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. You can get
It's
from it too.
A digest of peer-reviewed articles. STEM.
Yeah. I like all of these suggestions that everyone's throwing out. And I think another thing that, I try to consider, and this is coming from National Science Teaching Association, is just some ways to, it's not so much ways to necessarily improve scientific literacy in the sense of like your students are going to be better at reading science because you did these things, but it kind of sparks that interest, because if they care enough about it, then there's more of a desire to go forward with it and understand it at a deeper level. And a lot of these really link into that kind of last criterion that we have with that science and society link of, paying attention to personal and societal contexts in science. So something I've been doing for the past few years is I've taught an article called Sex Redefined, and it's actually like a little bit older at this point. It's like published in 2015 or something. The students are like, this is so old. I'm like, but but it is, I like it. Teaching it in Alabama and teaching it in Vermont have a little bit of a different feel to it. In Alabama, it gave students that were, very much like sex and gender on a binary, a way to kind of think beyond those terms and kind of think about the societal understanding of it. The article, I should back up, is really more about kind of what are these like sex differences that exist. People that maybe have more than 2 sex chromosomes, people that have mosaicisms where some cells are XX and some cells are XY. In the article, they talk about a man who was 70 years old and found out he had a womb, or a woman who was 90 and they took blood from her and found XY chromosomes. So how do we truly define sex, and how does that spectrum really lay out? So I found that it was an interesting concept in Alabama, for the sense that the students were like, oh, maybe there is something more to this. But teaching it here, what's really cool is my students are now saying, hey, like this gives a way to help people understand others. Like they're making that connection and that kind of getting on that science communication thread again, that if they can understand that science and find articles that help show the actual science behind a societal concept, then people might be more accepting of it. So that was a really cool thing that happened in class like 2 weeks ago, was just kind of having that conversation. But again, kind of relating that scientific literacy to traditional forms of literacy. Many students come in and they understand that, they should use the library for finding sources, or that they should look for things that are .org versus .com, right? But they do have some base level knowledge coming in most of the time. And in our science classes, we have freshmen through seniors, so we have wide range of knowledge and experiences. Teaching students how to find reliable information about science and how to reject junk science, again, kind of connecting back to their personal interests when they come in with those questions of like, hey, I saw this. It's a great way to kind of empower them to hone those scientific literacy skills to help them find the answers. Including important events in the history of science, and kind of along those same lines, helping female and minority students realize potential in science by linking back to diverse scientists in history and trying to highlight them in your teaching is something that I've kind of used throughout, and I'm sure many of you have as well. But I liked these strategies. But that's, I think, all of my commentary. So if anyone has anything else, I'm all ears. I'm really liking getting nuggets from others and thinking about how all of this is important to, the public.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about what
Kristen?
Thanks. Product. Kristen will product. Sabbatical brain, something to and that is like, how do you sort of walk the thin line between helping students understand that science is evolving, that the findings there, to be scientific, you always have to be open to the possibility of new evidence that could contradict your previous findings. Obvious, which became really obvious with the COVID thing. It's sort of less obvious for things that they're taught in high school, where they're sort of like, this is what is true. And so they sort of walk in. So on the one hand, sort of having them sort of respect that science has a lot of safeguards in place, right? And a lot of sort of self-correcting mechanisms. Some function better than others, obviously. But that really, to really properly understand scientific information, you have to know a little bit about probability too. So as all statistics come into it to some extent. And it's more of a challenge now because, going back to what you were saying, Mike, earlier, that there's sort of a skepticism about expertise in this country in general. Right? There's a tremendous undermining of expertise in this country. I think I remember Bruno Latour. I don't know if you've heard of Bruno Latour. He's a philosopher of science. He did these great studies where he looked at the culture of laboratories. So he took an anthropological approach to understanding how scientists operated. Scientists, a lot of natural scientists hated him. In fact, he was up for a job, and he was up to get a position at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and he was blackballed by the chemists. Like, we can't have him here because, you know, he's like calling into question our authority and prestige. Well, he came to UVM 5 years ago, and I went to go hear him talk with Robin Perlek. And it was interesting because he completely flipped. Whereas before, he said, I want to point out the ways in which the way in which scientific knowledge production is culturally influenced by, you know, the hierarchy in labs and, you know, what people want you to study and what gets funding and so on and so forth. And he says, now I want to defend science. I had to, because he said it exactly as Chris said, it's swung too far in the opposite direction. There's too many people who had too many doubts about science. And he says, I didn't have doubts about science. I just wanted to call attention to these ways in which it was produced. But he's worried that that work is now being used by people to then say, all right, plus we're not going to pay attention to science, period. We're just going to listen wherever some TikTok goes, just as good a source.
Well, there's scientists on TikTok.
Yeah, not be on TikTok. I couldn't tell. So, right. So, but I would love to know, and so how to sort of walk that timeline. Exactly what Kristen said. I've tried to address it in the times that I've taught the meaning science core class, which I love teaching. But I'd love to hear more strategies if people have ideas for sort of how to walk that line. Yeah.
I think a great way to walk that line, or at least demonstrate how that line gets crossed in different ways, is through the history of science and all the science that was poo-pooed or in prisons, back all the way to Galileo. I'm sure he had all sorts of mathematical equations no one understood, and they're like popped to prison. At a time, you know, they say the arc goes, humanity is towards justice. I think it's also towards, I don't know, justice.
Greater understanding.
It's a greater understanding. And sure, to a certain extent. And whether it's Galileo or the 4-year battle between the tobacco industry and kind of science, and like health community, that took 40 years. And now we all look back and be like, how foolish. Not seen that way at the time. And I'm sure there's things that are happening right now that are still in that questionable stage.
Yeah. It's like when I first started here, I adjunct, I taught nutrition, which is like not my area of expertise at all. But I did this whole thing on Linus Pauling, who's like a really famous chemist, and like contributed like a huge body of knowledge to the field of chemistry. But at the time, so I don't know if this answers your question necessarily, but it's just to show like how misinformation happens. So in addition to that, Linus Pauling also thought that vitamin C was the cure to the common cold. And because he had such a contribution in chemistry, people are like, well, it must be right. And so that's where like all of like emergency, like if you buy that stuff and you put it in your drink,
Doesn't work.
There's no evidence to show that there's any.
It works for you, a placebo effect.
But there is evidence, and it's often, this is where it becomes even more controversial, right? And this study will come out, and this study will come out.
Yeah.
But that vitamin C can help you fight off the sears once you have it. And so, but not necessarily not get. And also that cold winter athletes, that there's a study that shows that vitamin C helps people fight colds or not get them as easily if they spend a lot of time out in the cold. So
Yeah, no, you could always, like Sarah was saying, you could always find evidence. Right.
you said, no, that's what some.
He thought it cured more than the common cold.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bunch of other things he thought vitamin C would cure as well. And so
Scurvy.
definitely not supported. And
Yeah, but I just remember that being really impactful for students, because then we talked about vitamin C. It's water soluble, and how when you take emergency, it's like 3,000 international units or something, which is way beyond what you need. And so any excess you take, you're just peeing out.
I always talk about
expensive pee. Yeah, for reading. Exactly. With supplements, but yeah.
But I could change into the color, like, of your urine, right? That makes it bright yellow if you take a huge amount. And vitamin B makes it green, in case of
Didn't know that. And one semester I taught, I remember a student, I teach environmental science most of the time, and the student was like, well, I think it's like a conspiracy, that there's like a climate science agenda, and I'm trying to push this agenda. And I was like, well, I can't say that that's untrue, but I can't say that I've met a lot of scientists, and they're skeptical people. Like, the thought of them all competing and polluting and not challenging one another on something
you're in a
highly
Yes.
but like they're like I
Exactly.
I
It's
deal
part
with
of the
that in
conspiracy.
class.
Yes,
Like,
yeah.
I deal with that in class.
Right.
Like students that are like, I don't believe any of this, like this. Yeah. So
why don't they believe it? Like, what is, do they ever say what their particular source of, I mean, we know there's plenty of sources out there that come to like some scientists, but
one student that really thought that like contrails were like the government was
Yeah, the contrary experience.
flat Earth or like,
I publish it. This been stickers where I show like the different amounts of warming from different sources and like chemtrails from airplanes. It's like teeny,
Oh, yeah.
tiny in terms of water vapor leading to warming. But I mean, it's like, oh, we're in this too like, I don't know what to say to like this. It's not.
I remember like 15 years ago, it's like, yeah, like 12, around 2010, a conversation with a student about climate change. And he's like, well, we started talking about sources. And he says, well, he showed me this 120 slide PowerPoint from some high school teacher, but had citations all over the place. And so I'm like, I'm going to read this to see what it says. And there's one slide that stopped me dead. And it was like, I'm like, all right, well, if this is true, I'm going to revise. And a slide claimed that 68% of geophysicists are not convinced that climate change is happening. This is 2010. And so I brought that in a source. So I brought that to the library to Sean Leahy. I'm like, Sean, let's track this down. So we spent an hour and a half tracing the footnotes, the citations back. And we eventually figured out, it was from like 1987 and figure. So it's not a recent figure, but it was much earlier when there was sort of more uncertainty. It wasn't geophysicists, it was some other group, right? Still a scientific group. They were scientists, yeah, it was some other group, but less
Involved in that field.
less involved in that field. And it took us an hour and a half to trace this one citation. Right. And so that just represents the kind of challenge, right? And I think,
another example is where's the 6 feet come from? Just in the same 6 feet to
Just that feet.
yeah.
Oh, in terms of the social distance.
Yeah, they came
Which
back.
they keep-
It came from some paper in 1927 about, or something quite long ago, like in airplanes or something.
Yeah.
But there wasn't anything really, that backing up why its particular distance mattered.
Right. Because the air circulates like in like
Yeah, it was like very complicated. And it's like, so I'm found all these examples, like things where,
In some ways, it also relates to our own expertise as teachers, right? And so I try to be open about when there are things that I don't know. So if they ask me a question I know, and I say, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll see you in class. And I'll let you know what I found out, right? So you try to model that sort of curiosity, model that uncertainty, but then say, well, I have the tools to get a preliminary answer to that, and then try to help them acquire those tools as well. So here's where you might look for, and here's where you might model. So for that particular element, there's a lot of crossover with information literacy, right? The scientific reliability and argumentation is essentially information literacy as we defined it. And I think the main reason it's information literacy is because the other alternative is to know enough about the field that you can say, oh, their methods are bad. Right? And that's a really hard part for our students. Exactly. And so for that was the original intention in the rubric that was designed in 2018. Right? And over the years, we sort of come to understand that's just too much for the students that we're educating for the civic.
It's cheaper for an undergraduate student.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And when you guys think about sort of these media bias estimates, there's a couple of websites. I think some of the courses, navigating information, they're referring to those.
Mm-hmm.
But they're controversial in themselves, right? Like it turns out there isn't a lot of science behind them, and they purport to be, right? Like or their methodologies are questionable, and not validated, and that kind of thing. But that's a source that people point to is like, oh, I can sort of check that to see what a particular
Where the spectrum of a particular source falls.
yeah, and even that's sort of questionable to like put it on that spectrum anyway. Like what does it mean left and right?
What is that called?
Jess would know, I bet. Jess, you know that website, you know that source that is like sort of rates the different news sources in terms of where they fit on an intellectual spectrum.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of different
There's three Terraform.
that are at the top of my head where it tells you where it leans on the spectrum.
Right.
Yeah.
It's almost kind of disingenuous in a way because as if that is some criteria for judging the validity of a particular journalistic journalistic source, and does there's much more to truthiness, so to speak, than left to rightness. And it's in this to bias, what bias really means. I don't.
Yeah, well, they run it. The one I know runs sort of in a arc, and the apex of the arc, right? That one, right?
That's it. Yeah.
It's a great visualization. It looks like garbage.
Yeah, it's great.
What is it called again? I wrote it.
But the idea is that the higher up you are on the x-axis, the greater the degree of fact checking.
That's right. That goes on, right? So
Yeah.
maybe you can lean a certain way, but I don't know. I've always had trouble with like trying to fit things, like political things, onto just a numbered line. And it's really sort of a spectrum. It's like more but like it's more like in space and a cloud.
I do think the fact checking gets back to science, right?
Yeah.
Because if you can talk about in Core 103 about that, the organizations that have pay greater attention to fact checking, you can then link that to the way in which science has sort of built-in mechanisms, peer review and reproducibility and various aspects like that give you more confidence, or should give you more confidence in scientific findings than in non-scientific findings.
Hey.
Does anyone though question though? So when you were talking about that bias, in terms of so a lot of scientific studies are paid for through grant, or they're published by pharmaceutical companies, or they're published by like groups that basically all of your funding came from such and such organizations. So sometimes the answers that you're getting from some scientific studies are because those are the types of answers you're looking for, because who's paying for your research. So sometimes in terms of that funding through that grant or that endowment, actually it's because you are kind of helping support whatever kind of like that agenda of a group is. So for instance, you go through, and we see this all the time when we look at historical, and that doesn't have to be, and by historical, I mean like 1940s, 1950s historical, you can see that, the United States agriculture was like promoting how sugar is healthy for you and good for you, and you should eat more sugar. Well, we've now proven, obviously, 60 years later that sugar isn't good for you, even though the U.S. government was telling you that it was good for you back in the 40s and 50s, because they had an agenda in terms of who was paying for things. And so therefore, that's why the U.S. government was supporting how much sugar is. You should have more of it in your diet.
There's a sugar lobby.
Yeah.
So, like there's a tobacco lobby.
You did?
Yeah, pork
Lobby.
chicken lobby.
Dairy.
Yeah. Dairy lobby. And those are the types of things where I think that students don't realize how much scientific information they're being fed on a daily basis, that they don't realize it's scientific information. And you can't watch a YouTube video now without being seeing commercials where, take this supplement. You don't even have to go to a doctor to get it. And I promise all your hair is going to grow back. When I read like all these Nutrafol is
That's right.
really doctor, you can just order it online and get it delivered to your house. And like thinking, does somebody just like the person who orders it look it up before they order it and start checking out?
Just put the right search trends into Google.
Yeah.
You start catching.
I found it. Thanks so much, Jess. I'm going to credit you whenever I show up next year with a full head of wishes.
But those are the types of things that I don't think students realize that that's like every time they watch a YouTube video and they're being sold an antidepressant, do they realize that that's the scientific information to like X, Y, or Z? You might think you have this symptom, but do you really have this symptom? Like it's, and that's just on a YouTube commercial.
Really good. Like
There's those that you're all familiar with, SSRIs, antidepressants. So there was this controversy about whether or not, in fact, they were no better than placebos.
Oh.
And that it was hated by some of the major drug companies. And then there were these two meta studies done, which I don't understand. Meta studies to me, I think it's like you get all the studies. It's
Meta-analysis.
Yeah, right. And there are two of them that are pitted against each other. One saying, and they're the two major ones, and they both came to different conclusions. And so it's an example of like, and I think that we're using methods that are respectable, and they were in sort of an unfriendly sort of like interaction between these two groups, or so I'm
good time with. So I am mindful of time. So it's like there's more we could talk about. I would love to talk more about Point 5 down the road with people who are interested. Is to ways in which you can make scientific arenas more welcoming to females, minority students, and also sort of highlight the hidden role they played in science down the years. Would be very just, but there will be more resources for those of you who are teaching these classes. We're developing a website with this presentation and specific assignment prompts and specific classroom activities that you can do to help with our science literacy. And they're going to roll that out sometime towards the end of the summer, I think, is what I sent you. And that's for all the colleges. So keep that in mind. So there will be help for those of you who want to teach this better. That is coming very soon. And this was probably the first step. So thanks everyone for coming.
thank you.